So you have your bread maker or mixer. I've got a bread maker bucket here, digital scales, and you want, for 500 grams of flour, you want 300 grams of water. Okay, and the next thing you need is your salt. Now I have a micro scale there, which gives me decimal places, just so I can get the salt nice and accurate, but you could just use your normal digital scales. But you only want 10 grams of salt. And I'm using sea salt here because it's just pure salt. Whereas if you use cooking salt, they put a little bit of anti-caking agent in, which some people think, you know, is an artificial thing to mix with your sourdough bread, so why not use sea salt? It's just that little nice touch there. So there we have 10 grams of salt. Now the water that I put in, I very gently warm to a tepid temperature, just ever so slightly tepid, because it just helps the salt dissolve. But I'm sure if you just use normal cold tap water, that'll be fine. Now with sea salt, you do need to give it a little bit of a stir just to help it dissolve in that tepid water. I don't think it needs to dissolve completely because it will kind of mix into the bread when it's stirring the flour, but I just like to make sure that all the big lumps of salt there, the flakes, have dissolved into the water enough, and that's probably fine. Now, you then have the option of putting the starter in to the salty water, or you can put the starter in afterwards. I still don't know if it makes a huge difference which order you do it in, but I'm going to put the, I think I'll put the starter in last. Probably doesn't make any difference. So you can see we've got 310 grams of salty water there. So then you want 500 grams of flour. Right, so I'm going to reset the scale now and put in 400 grams of strong white flour. You want a really big spoon for this because it's a lot of flour. If you just use a normal serving spoon, it'll take quite a few spoons to do that. You could try tipping it in from the bag, but it tends to create clouds of flour in the air when you do that, so you don't want flour dust going everywhere. Right, and then I always add 100 grams of a brownish flour, and the one that I find best is Cotswold Crunch. It's approximately double the price of plain strong white flour, but it has this lovely kind of granular, kind of slightly brown looking texture to it. It says for bread and bread rolls with malt flakes, and it's got wheat, malted barley, dark rye. Yeah, so this is an artisan's flour, and this is what makes it that lovely, nice sourdough bread. Right, so I want 100 grams of this to take it up to 500. Just a tiny bit more. There we go. So there's our 500 grams of flour with our 300 millilitres of water and our 10 grams of salt. And that is the main ingredients before we put the starter in. So my starter has been over here, and it's on this warming thing at the moment because the kitchen's quite cold in the winter. So I use this thing I got on the internet, which just gently warms it for as many hours and the right temperature that I want. I've got it on 24 degrees. And it's been there for just over 5 hours. So as you can see, the level has risen very nicely. When I filled it up earlier with 50 grams of water and flour, it was only about that high. So it's more than doubled in height, and that's just good. So we just take the cloth lid off there, and we just scoop in. We're going to reset the scale and just try and scoop in. You see it's nice and bubbly and has a lovely kind of yeasty smell, and we want 100 grams of that. Nice easy figures to remember. It smells of beer. It's got that lovely yeasty smell, and we want 100 grams of that, so we want a little bit more. And of course we always want to leave a little bit behind in the jar because that will keep it going for next time. Nearly there. Doesn't matter if you go, you know, a few grams over. It's not a precise bit. A little bit more. That will do. There we go. Right, and as you can see in the jar, it looks like I've got about 1 spoon left, which is perfect because that's all we want. We're going to feed that in a minute and then put it back in the fridge. In fact, you don't have to feed it before you back in the fridge, but I want to add a little bit to that because it's pretty low at the moment. Right, so the last thing to put in is the seeds, and you can always put those in while it's mixing. You don't have to put those in right now. Sesame seeds. Now, I usually add about 40 to 50 grams of these seeds. There's this mixture, so a little sprinkle of sesame seeds, and I like to put some on later. Poppy seeds, give it a bit of crunch, bit of flavour. And then these. Now these are a mixture of sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, and linseed. So I'm just going to put in about that much. Right, and we'll just take that over to the bread maker. So with the bread maker, I'm putting it onto the dough cycle, which is 1.5 hours long. Turn it on. And the thing about a compact bread maker is because the bucket's quite small, the little paddle doesn't get the water and the flour mixing properly unless you give it a stir as well. Otherwise the water just goes round and round at the base of the bucket and leaves the flour floating on top. So you have to give it a little bit of a stir with a non-metal object because we're using a Teflon bucket, and just a few stirs like that, and that will get it going, and then you just leave it to mix. Now if you're doing it at a cake mixer kind of stand, then I think you want to probably do it for 20 minutes with a dough hook, which is how long this thing will go round and round for, about 20 minutes, and then it will rest. And what always happens is the dough sticks to the spatula, so I'm just using a knife there to just gently scrape off the dough so we don't waste any dough. And it will look like that. It's a big sticky blob of flour, water, starter and salt in the precise amounts. And we're just going to leave that to happily churn away for 20 minutes, and then it will just rest gently and warm in there under a gentle heat and start to ferment, and we'll come back to that in 1.5 hours. So the starter, right, so you've got your jar of starter. Now when you feed starter, you feed it in a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1. That means the same amount of water to flour to starter that's already in the jar, and you need to have some starter in there unless you're starting from scratch, and if you're starting from scratch it's going to be a week before you can start to use your starter. So as long as you've got some starter in here, and it only needs to be a few dregs, you know, about a spoonful, 50 grams would be ideal, but even the stuff on the side contains the natural yeasts from the air that will keep this starter going for years. So the next thing I'm going to do is get some water. So although I use tap water, 300 millilitres of tap water in the bread, for the starter, some people say you should use something better than tap water, something that doesn't have any chlorine in at all, or trace elements from tap water that might upset the yeast. So I'm using spring water, which this bottle lasts me many weeks, because I'm only using 50 grams at a time. And you could try using tap water, but then you might find your starter isn't very happy and doesn't bubble very much. So the cost of spring water is so cheap, this bottle will last weeks. So why skimp on using bottled water? So I'm going to put in, well, if I was feeding it, I would put in 50 grams. But because I'm not going to make bread for another couple of days, I'm only going to put in a little bit. I'm just going to put in 20 grams. That will do. And then you have to put in exactly the same amount of flour. Now, white top flour, you can just use your normal strong white bread flour, or you can mix in a bit of artisan flour and some rye flour if you want. I've heard that starter does love a little bit of rye because there are natural yeasts that are already in that flour. So, there's no secret formula to starters. It's just a case of usually using this kind of flour, but occasionally mixing a little bit of other artisan flours as well. So because I put 20 grams in there, I'm going to put 20 grams of this flour in. And when you've added your flour and water, you get your rubber spatula or silicone spatula and just give it a good stir. Make sure that the water and the flour mix with the starter that's already in there. And that will now start to feed the starter, but of course in this particular case I'm just about to put it back in the fridge for the next couple of days, so I didn't really need to feed it now. I could have fed it before I make the next loaf of bread, 5 or 6 hours, but I will have to feed it again before I make the next loaf of bread, because that's how you do it. But I'm just putting a little bit in there for now, simply because I thought it'd be nice to just top it up slightly. You've got your 2 lids. It comes with a metal lid and it comes with a cloth lid which is breathable, so that means carbon dioxide and the air can pass through there. So if you were leaving it at room temperature, you'd probably use this one, but if you're putting it back in the fridge where it's going to be dormant, then I use the metal lid. I don't put it on too tightly, because just in case it does produce some gas, I just leave it slightly loose like that, and then put that in the fridge. And the cold temperature just lets it sit dormantly. You can't leave your starter out at room temperature for days on end, because it would be very unhappy and it might even die. So you only take it out and leave it in the room in those 5 to 7 hours before you actually use it. So after you've churned your bread in your bread maker or your mixer stand, it looks like a big sticky blob of dough, and the next thing you have to do is transfer it into the banneton, which is this made out of cane basket with a cloth liner. And then what I usually do is sprinkle some seeds on the inside of the liner. So I've got some sesame seeds here, some poppy seeds, and the omega-3 mix, which is the sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds and linseeds. And then this is the awkward part, having to get the dough out of this because it's very sticky. You can kind of leave it in there for a few minutes for gravity to pull it out, but you'll still have to use your hand to pull out the dough that's still in there, or out of your mixer stand bucket. But you want to get as much of it into there as you can, and then it will just flatten out naturally. So I'm just going to leave that for a few minutes. So after you've put your dough in your banneton, it should look like that. It looks a little bit sort of messy on top, but it will flatten as gravity pulls it down. And you need to let that rest for a few hours. You need to cover it with some kind of bag. I use one of these things from Lakeland, which is just an elasticated cover. But you could use just normal cling film, or you could use foil, or just a plastic bag. Anything to just keep the air in like that. And then you just let that rest at room temperature in the kitchen for a number of hours. Probably I normally leave it for about 5 or 6 hours, and then it has to go in the fridge overnight. So I put it in the fridge last thing at night, just as I'm going to bed, and then it's ready to bake in the morning, having had 8, 9, 10 hours in the fridge overnight. So, and this will rise a lot. You'll find it will almost reach the top, and sometimes it will reach the top depending on how warm the kitchen is. So after you've had the sourdough dough in the fridge overnight and you take it out in the morning, it should look like that. Filling the banneton, you've taken the cover off, and then it's ready to bake. But before I do that, I like to put a few more seeds on the top, because this will be the underside of the loaf, because we're about to flip it onto in the Dutch oven shortly. I'm just going to put a few poppy seeds, sesame seeds, and omega-3 seed mix, pumpkin seed, sunflower, linseed. There we go, we'll just flip that in a minute. So then you just put your empty Dutch oven in the oven. So you put your empty Dutch oven in the oven and set it to 220 or 230. I'm going to go for 230 because it gives a slightly crisper loaf. And you want to preheat that for 15 minutes because it takes that long for the oven to reach that temperature, with the Dutch oven inside getting hot as well. So the next thing to do is to get the bread ready to put in the Dutch oven. And what I usually do after I put the seeds on the base of the loaf is to sprinkle a little bit of coarse semolina, which just helps it separate from the thing I'm about to put on it in a second. Which is this thing. It's a sort of silicone mat with ears, and you just put that on top of that, like that. And then you need like a soup dish. You want something which is a cross between a bowl and a plate. Sort of has a bit of roundedness to it, because that's going to take the base of the loaf. And you flip that on top like that, and then you turn the whole thing upside down, and then you lift off the banneton slowly, and you should find that your sourdough loaf looks just like that, and it's all ready to lift with these into the Dutch oven in just a moment. The Dutch oven has reached temperature. You can take that out of the oven. Close the door quickly to keep the heat in. Right, so you open that up, gloves off, and then you lift the ears of this thing, and you just quickly sort of move it across like that with the ears on the outside. And then just before we put the lid back on, they recommend putting a little bit of water, a couple of sprays on the top. You've got to score the ears in the dough. So you need a good razor blade, and you just cut it like that. And it's not cutting particularly well, but that will help it rise. Oh, it's just not cutting. It's a brand new razor blade. It's because the dough is too leathery, but it always is like that. Disaster. Right, and then a little bit of water just inside to create some steam. A couple of little squirts there. And then you put the lid back on. And then you put it back in the oven. And that now needs half an hour with the lid on. And then you're going to do quarter an hour with the lid off. And then after half an hour, you have to take the lid off. Now, with the Dutch oven, the lid is so tall that it's very, very difficult to take the lid off inside the oven, so it's easier to take it off outside. And then you end up with a half-cooked loaf, which is pale, and then that goes back in for 15 more minutes. And so, after 15 minutes of lid off time, you want to take it out of the oven. It should be nice and golden brown. And then you lift it with the ears of this thing onto there. Just use a spatula to take it off the silicone mat so it can breathe properly. And there we are. You want to leave that for a minimum of 1 hour before you open it and eat it. Longer if you like, but absolute minimum of an hour. Do not touch that. There we go. So has it risen a lot? Not a tremendous amount. I mean, for some reason, when I come to scoring with a razor blade around the top of the loaf to make the ears, the dough is quite leathery. I don't know whether that's because of the mix I use or the way it ferments or the lack of folding. Probably the lack of folding, but if I were to make it into a proper boule, I'd have to do lots of folding routine, and that's just going to make it sticky and messy to work with. So this is the minimum fuss way to make an acceptable sourdough loaf.